back to Wide Awake News Radio. We have 90 people in the chat. If you were in there and got out because of our technical difficulties, I think we got it fixed now. So head back in, wideawakenews.com, click on the second tab, and I'll take you into chat. You can post questions for Woody or myself. We have Woody back on Skype, but we have a backup number in case that goes down on us again. Anyway, we were talking about what Woody was talking about, and a great point. If you knew it was all coming to a crash and halt in the next day, week, month, you certainly might act a little bit different than you do right now. You might, prioritize things a little bit different. And Woody, this is one thing that I guess is at the forefront of my thinking whenever I see mainstream media or even alternative media doing this, I don't know what's called, pumping up agenda as far as the mainstream is concerned, and pumping up, a phony cause as far as the alternative media is concerned. I know people that I associate with in alternative media. For the most part, everybody I've met on this journey has had at the core, they cared about what's happening in their country. And I really met a lot of these folks in the Tea Party movement. I met a lot of them even in the Occupy movement and in the Ron Paul Campaign for Liberty movement. In the core, it's caring about your future, not just yours, your families, and the entire countries, and seeing the progression of the spreading of empire and the progression of the police state. It really, really affects people that are concerned about their country to the core. And when you see this nonstop distraction, it tends to get you a little bit ticked off.
It is frustrating, and it's important to understand that people who don't want to hear about what's really going on don't want to hear about it for a reason, and that is they don't want to be woken up, because you know what? They love their country too, and there's a part of them that knows if they really believed what we were telling them, they would have to do something about it. They couldn't sit idly by and watch football and watch American Idol and dancing shows. They would have to get involved and do something. But I would say the good news is there's a great metric about revolutions. Every revolution in the past 1,000 years was run by 1 to 4% of the total population. I like to use the example of the American Revolution in the 1770s. There were about 1 million Americans then, about 600,000 to 700,000 of them supported the king, but the only votes that counted were the ones cast by men at Valley Forge who were willing to cross the Delaware and risk dying on Christmas Day. In every revolution, there's a small committed pile of people who do the labor's work, and the rest of the people sit home and watch it on TV or read about it in the newspaper or hear it in books. So it is a frustrating thing to see how many people are kind of not really aware of what's going on. And the dangerous part of that is that we're going to get to collapse before we get to revolution, and those people are going to be hungry in a hurry. It's hard to imagine for people like me if you had a hyperinflationary event and say diesel fuel went to $12 a gallon. It's easy for me to imagine food store shelves getting empty in a real big hurry, and once they're empty, they would stay empty. We've seen this time and time again in natural disasters, from Katrina to every tornado and hurricane you can imagine, how the average person doesn't have enough food to last a week, and definitely doesn't have enough water. And I think water is a more important prep than food, because if you have a well with a hand pump that doesn't need electricity, you can potentially save hundreds of lives in your community, because that's how many people will not have access to water if there is a collapse where electricity stops.
Yeah, no doubt about it. I put your website into the chat room many times because folks have been asking for it. AbolishFiatSlavery.com is Woody's site. Woody, why don't you give us, because the show has been so goofed up technically, I should have started off with this. Give us a little bit of your background and why you started AbolishFiatSlavery.com.
Well, I'm an economist by trade, and I just retired from 33 and a half years working as a broker on Wall Street. In utter
it's your fault, Woody.
Yeah, in utter frustration of how corrupt and Ponzi schemish that the system has come, and frankly how corrupt it is. The regulatory system for regulating markets is really about putting little people out of business. and protecting big banks and big brokerage houses. But essentially, I'm someone who probably from the late 90s, I've been awake and understood, that what we really have is a global Ponzi scheme. It's a global looting machine. In America, we have a system that basically loots the income and wealth out of most of the country and puts that money into New York, into Washington to do stupid things with it. And the Federal Reserve controls the entire system. We literally have a system of fiat slavery, and that's the number one thing that we have to abolish. And if you look back through history, especially in the 1830s when Andrew Jackson repealed the second central bank, he let loose the longest period of non-inflationary growth in the history of mankind. We had an 80-year period of time where the net inflation rate over 80 years was zero. And in the 100 years now almost of the Federal Reserve, we've gone from a point where a $20 bill and a $20 gold piece would buy the same thing, where now a $20 gold piece will buy you $1,700 worth of goods.
Yeah.
And a $20 bill will buy you nowhere near what it did in 1913. We literally have this system that is such a conundrum, and it's so difficult for people to understand. And I use the simplest way I can imagine to explain it, which is to say that if any of us in our basement had a printing press and could print $100 bills that wouldn't be counterfeit and would be legal tender, the chances that we would ever be in debt are zero. As a matter of fact, if you could print your own money, the dumbest person who had that power would not be in debt. But if you look around the world and you see all these sovereign governments who have the ability to create debt-free money, and ask yourself, how are they in debt? How can these governments that have the ability to create debt-free money, how can they be in debt to investors and to banks and to the investors class? And the simple answer is because that's who controls them. The fact of the matter is that over a long period of time, these central banks have the ability to gain influence throughout the government and literally have a quiet coup. And if you don't believe that this is true, there's a simple way to test this theory. And that is to say, Charlie, if tomorrow the U.S. Congress took over or took the power to create money away from the Federal Reserve and it gave it to the First Bank of Woody and Charlie, and we were now the central bank, and they did that at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, how many minutes would it take until you and I were the two most important people in the United States?
About 2 minutes after that announcement.
I went to private school, so I think maybe 1 minute. But here's the thing, is once we would establish that power, if we decided we weren't going to be benevolent and use it for good, we could, over periods of time, over generations, we'd hire lots of Harvard and Yale grads, we'd hire lots of people from other Ivy League schools to do our bidding for us, and literally within 100 years, we would probably control everything. And in that control of everything, you could say to yourself, well, if there was somebody we wanted to be killed, would they be dead? Of course. If there was a war we wanted to start, could we start one? Of course. Could we make it look like people in a cave in Afghanistan made an airplane crash into a building?
Of course. Yeah.
The only thing more powerful than the ability to create money is the nuclear weapon. And in some ways, you almost need a nuclear weapon to destroy the power to create money. The founders never intended this power to create money to belong to central banks. They warned about it. As a matter of fact, the American Revolution, according to Benjamin Franklin, was about fiat money, that the colonies wanted to be able to circulate their own debt-free money. They didn't want to use debt from the Bank of England. And literally, this struggle for fiat slavery has been going on for 1,000 years. And that's the way that you can have people who literally work their entire lifetime. And even if they're terrible with money, they can end up broke. All the money ends up in the hands of the corporations and the banks because this system is really designed and built for them. If you can imagine giving an economist a blank sheet of paper and saying, come up with a system where people will work like dogs for 80 years in some cases and will die broke, and all the money will accrue to the rich elite, you couldn't do a better job than designing the system we have now.
Absolutely not. And In fact, I want to break that down a little bit. And I just sent Don a message saying, "Hey, thanks for turning me on to Mr. O'Brien because he's awesome." Because I've just sat there and listened to you, and I agree lockstep with every single thing you said. But I do want to play the contrarian a little bit because when I had Don on last, he made a very valid point that this revolution, it isn't going to happen. And now I'm going to play the contrarian point of view a little bit with you, Woody, because look, I think these central banks that are truly in this country, we've talked about, and you hear the mainstream pundits, Bill O'Reilly and Limbaugh and all these guys talk about the socialism in France and in Europe, but look, we're so far further down the road with total domination and control in the United States that Europe is trying, the central banking cabal that is overseeing the 500 million people of Europe are trying to play catch up. We have a central banking system that is writing the law, and the private banks that own it are writing the law that govern this country. Now, it seems to me that over the history of this nation, they've learned their lesson. They can't just throw a cold bucket of water onto the people and say, look, now we control the money, we control your lives, we control your financial future. It's a matter of the old frog in the boiling pot thing, heated up slowly. Slow destruction of the Constitution, slow infringement on your liberty, on your freedom, and at the end of the day, we've managed to shape a world in the West that truly believes not only in fiat money, but fiat debt. And this fiat debt is the ultimate control apparatus. If nations of the world have technocrats installed, wringing their hands over what you so eloquently described as an impossibility, nations do not have to have debt. They have the ability to print money without that isn't based on debt to buy their way out of any situation they're in. There is no reason to have $16 trillion in debt, national debt of this country. There is no reason for Europe to have this sovereign debt crisis. But when you have trained a populace, a planet-wide populace, that this debt is legitimate, it is not fraudulent, it must be paid back, and whatever happens, whatever occurs, we cannot let a default occur, because this would be the end of the world as we know it. This is the biggest charade of all.
It is because, and look at Iceland.
Right.
Iceland basically said, we're not going to pay, and they're about to have the fastest growing economy in the world.
3% unemployment.
People fundamentally don't understand there's a reality of that debt. When someone lends you money and they collect interest, that interest is their compensation for the use of the money and their premium for accepting the risk that something will go wrong and you will not be able to pay. Investors get paid a premium in the form of interest to accept the risk of default. If you cannot pay, you should default. The investor is supposed to take it on the chin. And this idea...
And in fact, Woody, that is fulfilling your obligation. If I have a mortgage with Woody's bank, and my obligation is to make a payment, if I don't make the payments, then my obligation is to give you that property. Either way, at the end of that contract, I've met my obligation. Now,
that's correct. And if it's a non-collateralized loan and I don't get any collateral in return, well, that's the risk that I took and accepted the risk that your credit would change, your income would change, and that I would not get paid. And the fact is because most of these banks are lending money that was created out of thin air. It didn't come from depositors. It didn't come from grandma's CD making a fraction of 1%. It came from lending programs of the Fed. If you default, it's no skin off their nose. The money didn't exist in the first place.
Right. No, I agree. And in the case of unsecured loan, no collateral, you do get a collateral. You get 30% up front if it's, O'Brien's credit card company. Your collateral is this massive amount of interest you're going to make on the front end. And it is figured in, it's baked into the pudding that you're going to have X number of default. Cleaning of the system of debt is part of capitalism, free market capitalism, but it's certainly not what we have running this government of this country and the world right now. Let's talk. Go ahead.
Well, Peter Schiff has a great line. He says that the boom is the disease and the bust is the cure. Ron Paul often talks about how debt has to be liquidated and washed out to sea. And I think that one of the problems with this is we live in a world where the vast majority of people think that they are destined to live and die in debt and don't really understand that in most cases, debt is an act of fraud. It's a fraudulent conveyance where you show up to borrow money to buy a house, and the note that you sign is then pledged to get the money from the Federal Reserve. The money doesn't actually exist, and that's the definition of a fraudulent conveyance and a loan that was never legitimate right from the get-go. I think the thing that's different here is that the political revolution to change this is going to be preempted by a collapse that comes before it, because a lot of these people who aren't awake and aren't listening and don't really care and think they're going to live and die in debt, they're going to have a change of opinion when they're hungry and when they can't feed their children. And that's the moment to which it is democracy is in the greatest danger, because we don't know what people will accept once they can't feed their kids and once they can't eat themselves. And this is a country, I'm 53 years old. The generation that I'm in has almost no connection to real suffering of the type their parents and grandparents experienced in the Depression. And and the younger people, to me, suffering by a 20-year-old means my smartphone signal goes down for half an hour. They have no idea what it would mean to have to grow your own food,
right,
or hunt and fish to be able to survive. We have no idea what the vast majority of Americans will do when they're faced with empty grocery shelves and no food.
You're absolutely right. In fact, one I think very accurate analogy is, well, I don't know if it's an analogy, but it's that the entire country, everybody everybody that thinks everything is under control because somebody that looks good in front of a camera says so, or somebody that is a paid spokesman for the mainstream media, business-wise or other, is everybody who thinks that they've got it figured out because they have skin in the game, be it a 401k or retirement or even a current job. Look, you are exactly 9 meals away from being a caveman. Literally. You're 9 meals, 3 days away from understanding what true suffering is and what true collapse is. Take those 3 days worth of calories away from you, you become very malleable. I've seen it firsthand myself throughout my life. You become a willing participant in anything that will get you that meal.
You get into a mode like a James Bond movie. How do I die another day? And to me, there's so much of this scenario that the way it's going to play out is going to be based on population density. If you live someplace where there's 10,000 people per square mile, you're going to have some real problems because those 10,000 people all want to eat. You're all going to be in competition for diminishing resources, because cities, by definition, are consumers of resources, and those resources have to come from someplace. They have to come from the countryside. Where, on the other hand, if you're like me, I live in a county that is geographically huge, and it doesn't have 25,000 people in it. I just bought a farm in a town that has 1,000 people in it. I'm not going to have a lot of competition for food, and the nearest city is an hour away by car. I don't think too many of those people are in the kind of physical shape required to walk to where I am to be able to ask me for enough grain to make a loaf of bread. So I do think there is this kind of danger that people don't understand, is the closer you live to a big population center, the more in jeopardy your life is, even if you're prepared. Because if you live in, say, a city like Washington, D.C., or a city like Philadelphia, and you've got all kinds of resources stored up in your house or apartment, if you're in a square mile with 10,000 other people, trust me, every single one of them will kill you for those resources.
Yeah, that just suddenly becomes, one day it was your resources, the next day it becomes pirates' booty.
It's really a math problem of population density. When I hear people say that they live in the inner city and they're trying to prep, I just want to say, don't bother.
Yeah,
because what you're going to be doing is you're going to end up feeding your neighbors. The safest place, I think, to live in America in the next 5 years is in rural states and in rural communities, especially ones that have strong farm-to-table food chains. I live in an area of eastern West Virginia that has a city that's got so many farm markets and organic ones to boot that you just go, it'll be very difficult for anybody to starve to death here. I don't think anybody will lose weight here unless they're trying to.
Right. And you'll see, I mean, I think if we did have a complete breakdown crisis, you certainly would see a societal return to an agrarian lifestyle. But you're right. I mean, most of the people trapped inside the urban jungle, look, you're not getting out. You're just not. What are you going to do? I mean, the food on your shelf, the food on your grocery store. I mean, I live in Montana, Woody. It's, and I think, are you originally from this part of the country?
Actually, I lived mostly in Pennsylvania and Wyoming and New Hampshire.
Okay. I thought I saw somewhere in reading up on you, Wyoming mentioned. So, but, if you go to a grocery store right now, right, and you go grab something off that shelf, know this. That item, whatever it is, travels 1,500 miles to get into your hand. Now, any number of crises develop. One of certainly could be a fuel crisis or an out-of-control hyperinflation on energy. And guess what? All of a sudden, 3 days from now, that's the average turn inventory of these supermarket chains. 3 days worth of merchandise is what they have on the ground. Again, it doesn't take very long to go from civil society into absolute pandemonium. About 3 minutes left. I definitely want to get you on again to talk about what breakdown collapse, what you believe it looks like. But as a career as an economist, 33 years on Wall Street, in the last 3 minutes, give us your take on how the sovereign debt time bomb is going to implode and maybe time frames.
I actually think that the forces of the dark side, as I like to call them, have very, very powerful tools. Not quite a Death Star, but pretty close. And I think they are in a full court press to prevent any kind of collapse event from occurring before the November elections. But once the November elections are over, the question to me is, will we have a collapse before the holidays, or will they postpone it into January? This is an old trick that politicians do. They try and keep gasoline prices low. They try and keep people happy. They'll bring troops home from whatever country they're raping and pillaging and make it seem like peace is at hand. And then January comes around and, we've got terrible problems. We need to raise your taxes and steal from you a little bit more. What exactly is the triggering event and how the euro collapses? Boy, that's anybody's guess. To me, it's just a certainty that situation there is not going to get better, short of countries defaulting on what is really unpayable debt. And I think the big thing for Americans is to stop thinking about collapse, especially preparing collapse, like it's a choice between gold and silver or silver and food. This is literally like a restaurant where you don't want to pick between filet mignon and lobster tail. You want to pick the buffet. You want to do lots of everything. You want to have food. You want to have water. You want to have seeds. You want to have a little bit of silver. You want to have guns and medicine and bullets and everything that you could possibly think of. There's a good list that's on my website. But think about if you couldn't go into a store and buy anything for 5 years, what would you need to be able to survive those 5 years?
No doubt about it. No doubt about it. About a minute left. I definitely want to get you back on because, you have some, from just what I've heard from you on the program, you have some interesting notions of what a breakdown would look like. As far as what I am monitoring with the European debt crisis and the folks I talk to in Europe, it seems to me that this full court press has one goal in mind, and that is to get rid of these 17 governments that are holding up the party. And when I mean party, I mean the cabal's party, to issue even more onerous debt onto the people of Europe. They have to get rid of these representative governments, even though they may be, just these token democracies. They are standing in the way of collaboration of power of the central banking cabal. And
sovereignty and national identity are the number one enemy of a global world order.
That's exactly right. And you have to, again, Wolfgang Schäuble coming out saying, that these identities, these sovereign identities are okay to have, but they have to give up their jurisdiction over their fiscal policy. And that is tantamount to a coup d'etat without firing a shot. It gives the power to the banks. It takes over your nation like it is done inside the United States without firing a shot. And in a lot of cases, you have the majority of the populace just sitting back, not even know this coup has taken place.
Well, if you don't have any economic freedom, you're not going to have any political freedom, either the next day or very shortly thereafter.
There's absolutely no doubt about that whatsoever.
Hey, Charlie, it was really terrific to be with you. I'm sorry we had a little bit of internet problems, but anytime that you want me back, I'm always available to you.
Well, I will. I'll contact you after the program tonight, and we'll definitely schedule you for getting back on as soon as possible. So, Woody O'Brien, thank you very much. Let me give out your website again. It is abolishfiatslavery.com. Go check out his website, read what he's got to say, and we'll get Woody back on the program. We'll try to get him back on within the next week or so. All right, guys. Thanks for sticking with us through our technical failures tonight. Hopefully we'll get this all resolved. Tomorrow we'll be back up and running at 100%. Please enjoy Jeff Rentz because he's coming up next. And again, go to the website, WideAwakeNews.com. Sign up for the newsletter. It's absolutely free. There's going to be no spamming. It's just another way for us to reach out and keep the communication lines open. All right, guys. Enjoy Jeff. He's coming up next. Have a good night. Peace.
A little red cover with a broken spine on the back. He hand wrote a quote inside. When the rich wage war, it's the poor who die. Meanwhile,